Hey, yeah, good morning, good afternoon, whenever it is you may be getting a look at this video announcement for week 4 of Native American Lit. Welcome to week 4. As always, those of you who managed to get to the discussion sections first or earlier in the week is always best. I try to step in and maybe make a comment or two as time allows for some stuff that I'm seeing in there. I sort of use what you guys are talking about and writing about in discussions in order to sort of put together this video announcement, and also to sort of let us, it's kind of a check-in for me to make sure that people are sort of understanding the material in sort of a meaningful way and engaging in it. So the sooner you can get to discussion sections, the better. I realize, a lot of this stuff sort of dumps in on Monday night, so I'll see a lot of it come in later tonight. Which is okay. That's the way the course is designed. But if you can get to it earlier in the week, if you'd like feedback from me, I'm always happy to sort of provide it. Some of the things I've seen people working with as we were sort of discussing, or you guys were discussing in your journal, in your discussion sections for this week, would be things like whether or not Eastman is an assimilationist and a culturationist, or what I would call a transculturationist, which is seeking to sort of, in some way, transform or sort of metamorphose, to go through some sort of metamorphic process, changing the very ideas of Sioux. And also sort of resisting. I think in some ways, in terms of the rhetoric that we use and the arguments that Eastman sort of makes in his text, as you sort of read the rest of it, I think you'll see that there's a reason that he assimilates and acculturates in the way that he does in the earlier sections of the book. I think many of those of you who argued for assimilation and acculturation, for assimilation in the early part of the book, are correct. He is deeply sort of driving himself into and converting, if you will, or at least on paper and at least in his writing, seeking, to sort of change what it means to be Dakota. And there's some very important things that I think we should keep in mind with Eastman, starting with his father, Many Lightnings, Jacob, where they're living in Santee in South Dakota, or in the Dakota Territories. They're doing something really unique. They evade, his particular family anyways, evades the reservation system. It's now a lands held in trust, but originally it was founded by people who went out and sort of homesteaded there. They established their own sort of agricultural community based on the Homestead Act of 160-acre land plots. So, that was pretty unique. They didn't sign treaties. These folks were this settlement that his father is referring to in becoming farmers. They engaged in the U.S. economy very early on, in the middle of the 19th century. Extremely unique. Also, what this does, though, which is unique, is it means that Charles Eastman, from the time he was raised and really for his entire life, although he spends a lot of time on reservations, he never actually is sort of there, never resides on a reservation because of treaty status. He resides on a reservation because of his own choice, because of a professional choice or an educational choice, or because of what he's trying to do, which I think is to promote understanding between whites and between non-natives and natives, right? And he does this through his role as an intellectual. I think he redefines what it means to be a native warrior. I think he's an instrument in some ways of what it means to change. And I think if we gain anything as we read Eastman sort of going forward, it's that he's very much an instrument for cultural change. And he sees education as very much an instrument for cultural change, but education that is in many ways engaged in on very Dakota terms, very unique sort of Dakota terms. This has strange, or not strange, this has a certain effect upon his life. It means that he's often what people would call in a liminal state, meaning that he's always somewhere in that borderlands. He's always somewhere in between those two cultures, which I think it was Emily Leach, I think, in the comments that I wrote back to her in the discussion section. She writes that she quotes Audre Lorde and talks about how the master's tools can never be used to bring down the master's house, the famous quote by Lorde, which I think is appropriate. for Eastman. And I think the question is basically, is acculturation the tool for sort of meaningful, in order to sort of bring down the sort of hegemony or bring down the hierarchy? Yes and no. I'll hedge my bet here. I think in the context of Eastman's life, or the historical period from which he was living, I think his choices were somewhat limited. I think if he was going to have a voice at all, there was going to have to be a certain degree of acculturation. I mean, this is mid-19th century, this is late 19th century and early 20th century. This is probably the lowest point in all of U.S. Native relations. This is the grinding, sort of disgusting, sort of end in some ways of U.S. Native history before we see some of the changes that sort of come forth in the 20th century. This is the end of this period that we all sort of understand to be U.S. Native relations. That is the closing of the West, the closing of the frontier, Wounded Knee, which you'll read about this week, the last great massacre, the death knell, some people have said. Eastman grows up in this time period. Eastman, but as I point out in my response to Emily, Eastman's upbringing until the age of 15 was to not spare the life of any U.S. citizen. That's it. Engage in guerrilla warfare and kill U.S. citizens. Not Canadian citizens, remind me, but U.S. citizens. So it's not a question of race for him. It's a question of, I was trained to be a warrior. I was trained to defend my territory and kill those that would encroach upon that life, specifically U.S. citizens. He moves a long way from that position. I think he sees the futility of military resistance. He sees the futility from a young age when he was 4 years old, and that his father was imprisoned for resisting militaristically against U.S. settler encroachment. So he sees what militaristic force will be. And yet, contextually, I don't think Native people were, it's easy for us to sort of sit in a 21st century place with our political structures and some of the sort of, bits of sort of political power that Native people have today that they did not have in Eastman's life. And in fact, they were deeply involved in outright genocidal practices. This was, I guess a comparison for this would be, the streets in Syria, or the streets in Iraq, or the streets in any other sort of war zone, the streets in Central America at times, the streets in, any place in the world where there is active sort of guerrilla warfare occurring. This was a reality, right, of Eastman's life at a young age. He comes from that point and sees acculturation as some means of carving out in some ways, some liminal space between militaristic resistance and intellectual resistance. And I think he carves that space for a very specific reason. I think that he assimilates into Christianity, and something Eastman never understands, I think, and we could fault him on this. He doesn't really see a great difference between his Siouan beliefs and Christian beliefs. And he continues to sort of compare them. So for him to move back and forth between Christianity and a traditional sort of Santee belief system is nothing for him. It may make us uncomfortable in the 21st century because we see him as somehow selling himself out, and maybe he did. But for him, I don't think it's as big a deal as we see it as. But I think he does this rhetorically. I think he becomes a Christian for very sort of interesting rhetorical reasons, and I think we'll begin to see those as we move forward in the reading of the book. So is he an acculturationist, and is acculturation the best tool to bring down the hierarchy? I think it can be used as a tool as a certain phase in an act of resistance, a certain stage in an act of resistance, but people must move through that stage of resistance. I would argue this. I would not be sitting here today teaching Native studies if it wasn't for a guy like Eastman. Someone else may be sitting here teaching Native studies if it wasn't for a guy like Eastman. And there wouldn't be Natives involved in the academy and the pursuit of sort of knowledge and the pursuit of sort of producing courses like this one, if it wasn't for the sort of early mistakes of people like Eastman. So their mistakes carved out places. And what Native intellectuals have done from that time to sort of move forward is take those spaces and allow us to continue to sort of voice our opinions and thoughts and ideas, and to construct courses around the writings of Native people from the early 20th century. So as a phase, without a whole lot of political resistance, this is not post-1960s and 1970s. You know, the world that we inhabit after the sort of great ethnic pride movements of the 1960s and 1970s is a very much different world. I would argue that because of people like W.B. Du Bois in the African American or Black intellectual communities, Ed Garvey, and others, right? And I could name others, Frantz Fanon and others, who to sort of push for, and for people like Gertrude Bonin and Carlos Montezuma and Charles Eastman, because they argued for the things they argued for, right or wrong. That we begin to today to sort of move forward into the 21st century in much stronger sort of political positions in order to begin to resist and determine self-determination. Not Eastman's era to sort of do that. I don't know if I answered your question or not, but I hope that I did in some way. But the discussion isn't over. We're going to continue to sort of look at Eastman's life as we sort of move forward. Be sure to get to the secondary readings if you can. The Warrior Servant, I think, that you had for this week. You'll read a more historical piece by Raymond Wilson just on the writings of Ohiyesa, and then you'll have Eric Peterson's article towards the end. So you're going to read up, I think, until, I don't know, page 120 or so in the text, 118, whatever it is. It's in the assignment section. So you'll spend the next couple weeks reading Eastman, and then you'll have a paper due at the end of that. As always, I'll get you a grading as soon as I can this week. And, you know, sorry it took me a little while to get to Saturday this past week. I also have a busy week this week. So it may take me until the weekend again to get to your work, but I'll get to you as soon as I can. Any questions, as always, please reach out to me. I'm happy to sort of hold discussions offline and outside the discussion boards if need be, and I'll continue to try to step in as I can. I hope you're enjoying the course. If anything is not working for you, please let me know. I'd be happy to make any sort of changes or adjustments that we need to. All right, thanks so much, and we'll talk to you next week. Yep, washed up.